welcome to Virtual Book Signing. I'm Daniel Weinberg, and as always, we're here at the Abraham Lincoln Bookshop in Chicago. We try to help you get the best in history and first editions and signed with the discussion of the author to back it up. So we hope you'll enjoy this as always. Today, we have two wonderful books and two wonderful authors for that matter too. Gail Stephens is a graduate, did graduate work at Johns Hopkins and at Harvard University, a retired U.S. Department of Defense employee as a member of the department's senior executive service, and serves as a volunteer at the Monocacy National Battlefield. She lectures on the Civil War, Monocacy, Lew Wallace, and the 1864 Maryland campaign especially, and teaches Civil War courses at area colleges and gives battlefield tours as well. I look forward to doing that sometime. Today, we have her latest book, The Shadow of Shiloh, Major General Lew Wallace in the Civil War. It's an Indiana Historical Society Press, 301 pages, and is $27.95. It did win New York's William Henry Seward Award for Best Civil War Biography of 2011. Congrats.
Thank you.
We also have Elizabeth Leonard, the John G. and Cornelia V. Gibson Professor of History at Colby College, and a PhD in United States History from the University of California in Riverside. She's the author of Lincoln's Avengers, Justice, Revenge, and Reunion After the Civil War, All the Daring of the Soldier, Women of the Civil War Armies, and she's edited and authored the introduction of Memoirs of a Soldier, Nurse, and Spy, A Woman's Adventures in the Union Army by Sarah Emma Edmonds, among others. Today, Lincoln's Forgotten Ally, a necessary book, frankly. Judge Advocate General Joseph Holt of Kentucky. University of North Carolina Press, 417 pages, and is $40. So, as always, I ask each of you to tell us a little bit about the inception of the book. Elizabeth, maybe it's interesting that you got to Holt through Mary Walker.
Right.
Please explain how your how Holt got to you this way.
Okay. Well, my very first book was Yankee Women, Gender Battles in the Civil War, and I look in that book at three different women who served the Union in various ways. And one of them is Dr. Mary Walker, who became a contract surgeon for the Union Army. And towards the end of the war, when she knew that service would end, she wanted very much to continue to serve in the Army in the medical department. And she requested the opportunity to do so. And it was Joseph Holt who wrote the legal opinion to Andrew Johnson saying there is no precedent for that, for a woman in the Army in peacetime, or in wartime actually. And he said, let's give her the Medal of Honor and send her on her way. In essence, that's a paraphrase. Well, I was very angry at him about that and remained angry at him for many years. But when he cropped back up as I was studying the Lincoln assassination, I was drawn to see if there was anything more I could learn about him, this man I'd been angry with for several years. And sure enough, there was. And my interest in him grew in connection with that book as I continued to study his role in that trial. And then I came to this book because I felt like no matter how much we talked about the trial and Holt's role in that event, and the assassination's aftermath, there was just so much more to his story that needed to be told. And the last thing I'll say is that in my study of his life and in my reading of his papers, I was interested to discover that towards the end of his life, he and Dr. Mary Walker reconciled with each other and became reasonably good friends as far as I can tell. And there are a number of letters in his collection from Mary Walker to him showing that she forgave him. And so I feel I have had to forgive him too.
I like that. Well, Gail, tell us about your book and with Wallace.
About my fascination with Lew Wallace?
Exactly it.
Well, as you said, I've been a volunteer at Monocacy National Battlefield since 1997. And at Monocacy, Wallace performed absolutely sterling service for the Union. Basically stopping a Confederate army long enough to enable Grant to reinforce Washington, D.C. And I began to think, why isn't this man more famous? Why didn't he have larger service in the Civil War? Well, when you start looking into the story of Lew Wallace, you almost automatically run into Shiloh. And when I started asking people about what happened to Lew Wallace at Shiloh, the almost uniform answer was, well, he was lost. Now that's, the man who fought the Battle of Monocacy would not have gotten lost on a battlefield. And I thought, I don't believe that story, and I'm going to start looking into it. The more I looked into it, the more I dealt with Wallace and his letters, the more fascinating I found the man and his Civil War career. And he was essentially part of a theme in the Civil War, which was the political generals versus the West Point graduates and the regulars. And the theme just was something I felt I had to write about, and Lew Wallace was a fascinating character in which to set that theme.
Well, you mentioned character, and that's what I'd like to ask both of you, actually, about the character of each of your protagonists. I know that Holt was, hard-headed and hypersensitive and other things as
All
well.
of those things, for sure.
Intelligent man, but so was Wallace an intelligent man, but also could be impatient and arrogant,
Oh, yes.
walk
Oh, yes.
away from things when he's bored and unhappy, but then he was intelligent and romantic. Gail, why don't you start out and tell us about the character of Lew Wallace?
Well, Wallace was, as you mentioned, he's a very intelligent man. He had this keen, inquiring mind, and he loved to learn about different things. He could write a book about the Aztec conquest of Mexico, the Spanish conquest of the Aztecs. He could write a book about Christ. He could be, and did study military tactics. He was at base a lawyer, and this is something about his character. He hated the law. He called it that most detestable of occupations, and it was because it was boring to him. He was very easily bored. He was quite arrogant, especially early in the Civil War. He was a man of prickly pride, but a very honorable, a man who believed in honor. He was also, and this is one of his most wonderful characteristics, he was a great romantic. Obviously, anyone who could write a novel like Ben-Hur was a romantic. But I think my favorite story about Wallace and romance was that Meredith Nicholson, another prominent Indiana writer who knew Wallace, said that Lew Wallace was the only man he knew who could dress up in a full suit of armor, ride down a street, and seem perfectly natural doing it. So he's a wonderful character to study because there are so many facets to his character.
Well, another person who could be prickly,
Indeed.
yes,
Yes.
was
And
Mr. Holt.
multifaceted.
And multifaceted as well.
Right, right. Yeah, I would say so many of the things you said about Lew Wallace, Holt shared similar characteristics. He was very, very bright. He was very learned. He was extremely accomplished as an orator, very highly respected as a lawyer, very dedicated to the law, and someone who was perhaps not initially ambitious in his own right, but bore the burden of his family's desire that someone from Stephensport, Kentucky should become a national figure. And he carried that forward into a very significant career, including many, many years in Washington and 4 administrations. But he was a difficult and complicated man with flaws and strengths. And like you, I think that that's one of the things that keeps me fascinated with him. And despite having written a biography that's over 400 pages long, I think there's easily, again, that much to say about him. His pride, his oversensitivity, his talents, his struggles with personal intimacy, his relationships, his friendships, his enemies. Very, very complicated and interesting man.
Well, and it comes out in both of your books, the character of the man, and that was fascinating because you get behind that
Yes.
sometimes, and just the battle that we always
Yes.
think of them in to be. I'm going to parallel subject because we're going to get into, of course, the assassination of Lincoln, and they were involved in the conspiracy trials together. But I do want to ask because I think our audience will want to know. The Conspirators, the movie. What did you think about
yes.
that and how the portrayal was in that?
Well, you want me to start? Or?
I think you should start.
Yes, because I have so much to say about that movie. Perhaps I'll use up all the time.
Oh, well.
As I've said to many people, I found the movie. Well, I'm delighted that there is a movie about the Lincoln assassination conspirators, because I'm delighted that there was an attempt to bring this story to a larger audience. The actors are wonderful actors whom I greatly respect. I greatly respect Robert Redford and much of what he has done so far, but I think this movie is a travesty in many ways. To me, it seemed like an apology for the lost cause. I felt that it's historically so full of inaccuracies as to really make you laugh. I mean, it was hard for me to watch it without seeing all of those things, and I could just list them, but I won't. What I think bothered me more than anything, besides the historical inaccuracies, just the little details and the way the trial is portrayed, however, is the way that Stanton and Holt are portrayed. And I think they both are depicted as purely one-dimensional images of a vengeful North that cannot forgive the waywardness of the poor South, which had been beaten to a pulp anyway by Grant the Butcher and should be just forgiven. And I feel like Mary Surratt becomes that character of the poor South, and then you have the vengeful Holt and Stanton depicted in ways that I think they did not behave and would not have behaved. So I have a lot of problems with the movie.
Well, I must confess I haven't seen it.
Mm-hmm.
I was waiting
You're the lucky one.
to see. I was waiting to see what the reaction from friends of mine who had seen it would be, and I knew that I wouldn't want to see it when a friend of mine said, "Well, you know, it's just terrible that they were tried by a military commission." Well, I beg to differ. Washington, D.C. was under martial law. A military commission made a great deal of sense. Military commission was not necessarily a railroading scheme. And since then, several people have talked to me about what they took out of the movie. And it's exactly what you said. And I thought, I really don't think I want to subject myself to that.
Right.
I think we do have a problem in this country with portraying history in the movies. We tend to romanticize it. And just portraying the straight historical event is often would be fascinating, but
the real story is good enough.
Yes, exactly, exactly.
Hollywood doesn't seem to think that.
No, unfortunately.
Well, and it does
The
seem
Ten
very.
Commandments is the only one that they were really solid.
It does seem very purposeful. It seems as if the movie is really not about what it claims to be about. And something I've said to people that I think is very interesting in relation to Holt in particular, which one person who knows a lot about Holt said, "Oh, that's an insignificant detail." But I think it's a significant detail that Holt in the film does not speak like a Kentuckian. He speaks like a Yankee. And I think that is a significant detail, because by the time he got to Washington, he was 50 years old. He would have come in with whatever his accent was from Kentucky. But because he's meant to play a vengeful Northerner going after the poor, pious South in the form of Mary Surratt, he can't be portrayed as who he was, and it completely flattens out the complexity of what this Kentuckian was dealing with personally and professionally in pursuing this trial.
It's one of the things that really concerns me. Wallace, who was a fair and honorable man, was totally convinced that they had gotten a fair trial. And so this issue lives on, that these people were railroaded. And it was one of my moments while I was writing the book when I found out what the conspiracy law actually was in the 1860s. And as soon as I read it, I thought, well, they were clearly guilty.
Exactly it.
Right. And in a civil trial, they would have had the same
Yes.
conclusion,
Yes.
I'm sure.
Yes.
I would think so.
At,
too.
this, at that moment in time, I think a civil trial would
But
have
it was
found.
Holt was in the Buchanan administration.
Yes.
And he was offered and accepted the post of interim Secretary of War. And you write they became the animating spirit of the administration during that time before Lincoln came into Washington and was inaugurated. So as interim Secretary of War, He, as you write, held the collapsing nation and the federal government together from December 31st to March 6th. Tell us a bit of how he did that and what he did.
Well, he tried to do it, I guess I
Yes,
would say. He
exactly.
was, Buchanan's cabinet, soon after the election of Lincoln, began to fall apart, and it began to fall apart even more after South Carolina seceded. And there were many people within Buchanan's cabinet who were not convinced Unionists. And when the Secretary of War's position came open because of somebody resigning, the Virginian John Floyd, Holt was asked to step in, and he did. And he and Stanton and Jeremiah Black became the three strongest pro-union members of Buchanan's cabinet. And as Secretary of War, Holt was responsible for many things. He was responsible for dealing with the continuing secession. It wasn't just South Carolina, of course. Very quickly, 6 other states claimed that they were leaving the Union, and they also took their senators and congressmen with them. But meanwhile, as those government operatives, these senators and congressmen, were moving away from Washington, they were nevertheless asking for all kinds of information about military installations in their states, trying to get information that could help prepare their states for war against the Union, and Holt was responsible for trying to keep that information from them. He also had to deal with all of the military installations that were being turned over to the Confederate States by often soldiers in U.S. Army uniforms. So he was dealing with that. He was dealing with the building up the defenses of Washington so that Washington would be safe. And he was also responsible for making sure that the president-elect could get into Washington safely and be inaugurated safely. And in his day, certainly in the spring of 1861, he was widely recognized as the person who made sure that Lincoln made it in and was not assassinated on his way into Washington, and that there wasn't some kind of upheaval at the inauguration and so forth. And the other thing he did that I didn't mention is that he sent the Star of the West. He was the first person to try to fortify Fort Sumter. It wasn't successful, but he tried. So there were many things he did, and I find it fascinating that even just those, 10 weeks have been lost on our historical map, that we don't realize that. And that's just the beginning of what he did in the period of this crisis.
Well, also, just before that, of course, he was Postmaster General, getting there because he had been a Jacksonian Democrat who had supported Douglas, Breckinridge. So that's how he got that post. And during that period as Postmaster General, he was trying to stop material against the Union.
Abolitionist tracts, but also secessionist tracts.
Yes. All that sedition material, he tried to stop that as Postmaster General. Now, Wallace, he had actually supported before that Douglas, and I'm sorry, I'm getting mixed up here, and Breckinridge. How did he come into Union through Stephen Douglas and Breckinridge?
Well, Wallace was absolutely devoted to the Union. That was, he was a Douglas Democrat before the war, very much a Douglas Democrat. Douglas was he wrote his political idol before the war. But within Wallace there was a very deep unionism. And the very first day of the war, the governor of Indiana, Oliver P. Morton, because Wallace was a prominent Democrat and also a prominent military man in Indiana. He had raised and trained the best volunteer militia in Indiana. So Morton asked him to be the state's first adjutant general. And Wallace left the trial he was in, turned it over to his number 2, and rode to Indianapolis and said, "I'll do it, but I'll only raise the first set of regiments which Lincoln requires under the first call, because I want command of one of those regiments." So from day one, Wallace was a Unionist. Now, over the next year, as he moved, particularly in 1862, when he moved into the South with his division, and he saw what was happening in the South, and he saw that the slaves were actually the military underpinning of Southern might, he became one of the first generals to say, we should use contrabands, former slaves from the South, slaves who had crossed Union lines, in the Union Army, and we should arm them. And from that time on, he became essentially a Republican. It was in 1862 when he became a Republican.
And at that point, Holt is writing legal opinions saying we need to arm those soldiers. It's legitimate to arm those
It's
black
so
men.
strange to see that from Holt, for
Right.
heaven's sakes, where he came from in Kentucky. His brother Robert was a slaveholder, and Holt was a slaveholder. His
Right.
father was
His
the
whole family, the whole family was
And
slaveholders.
so that he came to this conclusion himself. How did that work in his mind?
I think that that's actually one of the most fascinating parts of his story, and as I was saying to a group yesterday, it's one of the, when I think about Holt's less appealing characteristics, I remind myself how strongly he stood, not just for the Union, but also for emancipation, and then after the war for the rights of the freed people. But how he got there is an interesting story, and I think he really struggled with slavery from early on. Though he grew up in slaveholding Kentucky in a slaveholding family and owned slaves himself, but he struggled with it. We know he did because there is a speech from when he was in college, from a debate, it looks like, where he made a very strong statement that was anti-slavery. There are also letters from uncles with whom he had regular correspondence as a young man, where his uncles are saying, we just have a feeling someday you're going to become an abolitionist. Please don't do that. Don't turn your back on your section. Where he finally made the decision, though, was when it became clear to him in the late 1860, or really late 1860, I would say, before he took that position as Secretary of War, when he realized that the Union was about to be destroyed because of slavery, and slavery would never mean enough to him. That was the tipping point for him. He said, then slavery has got to go. I think from that point, it grew into a much broader humanitarian concern. But the initial decision to dump slavery came when it was clear that slavery was the threat to the Union, and then Union was more important.
After the war, how did he get right with his family, or vice versa?
Well, he didn't actually for quite a long time, but all of his family had gone with the Confederacy virtually, except for one very charming aunt who wrote him extended, lovely letters that are all in his archives. But everybody else went with the Confederacy, but his one brother, Thomas, a younger brother, his son and his wife, Washington Dorsey Holt and Vonda Holt, his wife, nurtured a reconciliation. I have a feeling they did not ever, that slavery was not ever set aside in the hearts of this niece and this nephew and his wife, but Holt and they tried to find a way back to having some kind of relationship, and they succeeded. And actually, it's the descendants of that brother, Thomas, and of Washington Dorsey and Vonda, who are still living, who in their family, their growing up, were taught that Joseph Holt was the hero of the Holt family, not their their own direct ancestor, Thomas.
Wallace had a very interesting evolution on black-white relationships because, of course, Wallace was from Indiana. He had no slaves. He had very little acquaintance with slavery because he was from central Indiana. He saw during the war, as I said, that slavery was a military necessity to do away with slavery. After the war, he said nothing until he returned from Turkey. And in the Spanish-American War, Wallace, being the fighter he was, wrote to the Secretary of War and said, I want to raise a brigade of Negro troops. Oh. And I thought, well, that's interesting, because he hadn't said anything about it in any previous correspondence. And then I read a letter in which he said the Sultan of Turkey had Negroes as his bodyguard. They're fantastic fighters, and therefore we should have them in the army. Now, that was an evolution, and then early in the 20th century, he attended a football game at his local college, Wabash College. Wabash had one Negro player on their football team, and they were playing another Indiana team, and that Indiana team said, we won't play you if you play that Negro. Well, Wabash folded. Wallace was at the game. He found out about that at halftime. He went into the locker room, and he said, you are a disgrace to your country, and you should go out there with that black player and let him play. And by golly, Wabash did it. So he had this almost incredible evolution to where he was he had been thoroughly anti-Negro before the Civil War.
How did he feel about black troops during the war?
He was very much a supporter of black troops, very much, arming them. He was the first in June of 1862. He gave a speech saying we should arm the contrabands, put them in the army.
Right.
And then he was very much after that a supporter of black troops.
I'm not even going to go into football this weekend, and what should be happening in a football game at halftime today or even
There you go.
beforehand. Since we're on the subject a bit, Holt was the Judge Advocate General
Right.
during the war, and he had an interesting caseload, which you explain in here, especially in regard to the black soldiers, the Lieber Code and the civil liberties. Milligan, Vallandigham. All of this was under his watch. Tell us a bit about his job as judge advocate.
It was a lot of work. I know it was a tremendous amount of work. He oversaw thousands and thousands of cases a year that went down to the lowest case to the highest case, cases that involved soldiers, cases that involved civilians, and cases that involved some of the most high-profile figures, Fitzjohn Porter as well. Very high-profile cases which threw him into the public's eye. So he had a tremendous burden of cases. He had a lot of very high-profile cases that produced a lot of public sentiment on both sides, as well as sentiment within the military. And meanwhile, he was also running a bureaucracy. So he was not, he had people who were working with him, and he was trying to define, in the context of this war that was becoming bigger and bigger, what exactly military law should be. So he was involved in helping to develop the Lieber Code and so on. So it's a massive amount of labor, and his influence was everywhere, which makes it also interesting to me that we don't think about all of that. We only focus on, if we remember him at all, on the assassination trial.
Why don't you tell us a little bit about what did he think of himself as a
No.
martyr at all in that?
No, absolutely not. That is a famous myth.
I'm glad I brought it up.
Yeah. Wallace did not feel that he was a martyr. Wallace had this tremendous post-war career. He had, territorial governor of New Mexico and U.S. minister to the Sultan of Turkey. He had written The Fair God about the Spanish conquest of the Aztecs, which was a relative success. The reason he wrote Ben-Hur, he had always been fascinated with the story of the three wise men. How did these guys know where they were going? How did they know to follow this star? Who were they? Where did they get together? So he started to research and write that, and he was on a train with a gentleman named Robert Ingersoll, who had actually fought in the Civil War, but after the war became what I can only call a famous traveling atheist. He would travel from city to city, and he would give lectures and challenge Christians about Christ. Jesus,
sounds
was
like
he
Bill Maher.
divine? There you go. Was he divine? How do you know that? Was he the Son of God? How do you know that? Wallace met with the man one night on a train, and Ingersoll invited Wallace to sit down and talk, and they chatted for hours. Wallace got off the train, and he said to Susan, his wife, well, here I know nothing, I realized, about this religion that I pretend to be a member of. So I'm going to write a book about Jesus. The result is Ben-Hur. So it had nothing to do. No, Wallace is not Ben-Hur, and Grant is not Masala, which is what a lot of people say. That is just
Talking
baloney.
about that in this book that we were just showing,
That's wonderful.
reprint of Ben-Hur, this happens to be signed by Francis X. Bushman, who then puts in quotes underneath Masala.
Yes, which is probably the best role in the book, I think. But
Well, he had a tendency, I found it interesting, he had a tendency, there are many legal opinions in his papers, and there are opinions where blacks, either soldiers or civilians, come into contact with whites who have abused them terribly, and then they commit violence against those whites. And it's fascinating to me to see Holt, without one exception, not exactly defend blacks' violence against whites in those settings, but to always try to explain how one can expect that that violence would arise out of the situation of slavery. And you cannot take a man and humiliate him for years and for centuries and then expect him not to blow up at the end.
Yes.
You know, talk about honor and the same kinds of feelings that Lew Wallace had. But Holt was able to extend that to black soldiers as well, and black civilian men too.
I need to get to the chase for both of you here.
Ah.
Let's first go to Shiloh.
Oh.
All right.
Okay.
The major knock on him is that, as you mentioned, he got lost, didn't get up there in time to help Grant. Grant wasn't happy with that. You write that he was not lost. So please explain the persistence of criticism against him. And, you know, Wallace made a number of things here. Wallace made that march post-war to see if he was correct.
Yes.
You've made the march since
Yes.
then.
Yes.
And tell me the changing stance that you've seen on Wallace.
Well, most of the origin of he was lost, he was guilty of intolerable delay, comes from Grant's staff. Grant did not see Wallace until the end of the day. It was Grant's staff that was with him. It was Grant's staff that made these accusations. I might add, they were only written down in 1863, a year after the battle, but they were persistent. Grant was the hero of the war. Grant's staff was associated with the hero of the war. And in 1868, when Grant ran for president, Adam Badeau, who had been his military secretary, wrote a campaign Life of Grant, in which he accused Wallace essentially of losing Shiloh on the first day. For Grant. And because he was foolishly off the road. So, here is Wallace accused by the premier soldier of the Civil War. Grant believed his staff, and Grant supported these accusations until, interestingly, he died. And just before he died, he received information and that caused him to change his mind. He put a note into his personal memoirs. If you look at the chapter on Shiloh, at the end of it, there's a note dated June 21st, 1865, in which Grant essentially exonerates Wallace by saying, I am not competent to say just what order the general received. And of course the issue was, what was Wallace ordered to do? Grant did not write his own order. Someone else wrote his order. So that I think by the time Grant wrote this note, he realized what had happened. He realized he did not actually know what he had ordered Wallace to do. So the persistence of the story is due to the fact that it was the premier soldier of the Civil War who accused him. The fact that he was exonerated in a small note added at the end of his personal memoirs, and the fact, quite frankly, that no one since has taken up the story and tried to figure out what really happened. Because it is, as all these things, I could spend hours on the complexity of what actually happened.
You know, we had one question I'm going to read here that one of our staff, Bjorn, mentioned. Was it Grant's response to Wallace's Shiloh March that sidetracked his career? Or was it Wallace's response to Grant's response to Shiloh?
It was, in essence, and this is where it gets very interesting, this is where the theme of the political general versus the regular comes up. It was Wallace's response to Henry Halleck's use of him after the Battle of Shiloh. Because after the Battle of Shiloh, when Halleck took command of the joined armies of Grant and Buell to make that long movement on Corinth, Halleck put both of his premier political generals, John McClernand and Wallace, and their divisions in the reserves. Wallace did nothing for the rest of April, for the rest of May, for the rest of June. So at the end of June, he left Grant's army. He simply left, never to return. His return was postponed when the governor of Indiana asked him to raise a division, which he thought he would get command of, but Halleck, by this point, Union General-in-Chief, a very powerful man at this point, was never going to give that division to Lew Wallace. He then went and performed one of his great services, which is totally unknown, saving Cincinnati from the Confederate army of Edmund Kirby Smith. He was ordered back once again, and this is where he gave Halleck his opening. He cabled Halleck, and he said, "I don't want to go back. Grant and I don't get along." And that gave Halleck the opportunity he needed to sidetrack Wallace onto a commission. By the time he finished that commission in early 1863, his 30 seconds of fame were gone, and Halleck sent him home.
Well, also this is the Buell Commission.
This is
you're
the Buell
speaking about.
Commission.
But also didn't he criticize Halleck during
He did
that?
do that.
Did that
He
play a part?
criticized, actually, Wallace was not politically sensitive in what he did. I told you he left the army at the end of June 1862. Well, what he did was he said, "I'm going home to conduct business." But within 2 weeks, he was in Washington, testifying before the Congressional Joint Committee on the Conduct of the War, criticizing both Halleck and Grant, which was a very bad and a very stupid move, because 2 days after his testimony, Halleck took command of all the Union armies. So it was essentially, it was not Grant. Grant would have taken Wallace back. Grant had plans for Wallace when in September 1862. It was Henry Halleck. And it was this issue. Halleck was intent on ridding the Union Army of political generals. Politicians, he called them corrupt politicians. And he was intent on removing them, and Wallace was he said it was a little better than murder to give Wallace an important command. So Wallace was one of the people he wanted to get rid of. And he did it. For a while.
For a while. But he was able to get back. We'll get back to some of that. We're going to now go again. I'm going to cut to a chase by going around it for a moment. I happen to have here for appraisal right now Christian Rath's letters home. Christian Rath was the main executioner for the four who was hanged for conspiring to murder Lincoln. Amongst some of those letters, by the way, are his epaulets as captain, and also this string, which I believe is one of the strings that was holding one of the hoods on one of the prisoners. And this was kept as a souvenir, after they were taking parts of the scaffold off even before the hanging. And they were keeping pieces of rope and this and that, and Rath kept this. Now, in this representative letter that I have here of Rath, but in another letter, he says that he was ill-prepared for the execution because they became, the prisoners, as he was guarding them, helping to guard them, became flesh and blood to him. And he felt a little differently toward the end, although he felt they needed to be hanged. But, as he said, he was ill-prepared. But as a soldier in the line of my duty, I was obliged to perform the part assigned to me, which neither man nor money could have hired me to do, were I not a soldier in the service of the U.S. But what really appalled him is that he had to hang a woman.
Ah, yes.
And so for the first woman, Mary Surratt, to be hanged by the federal government, he was implicit in that, and it really bothered him afterwards. So again, I'm going to cut into the chase. Did he, when he came to Andrew Johnson, show that clemency order or nay?
I believe that he would have shown Johnson the entire or record of the trial and whatever papers were necessary for Johnson to see. So I'm going to say yes, I think he showed him the papers. I can't say that he shuffled through the papers and pointed out to him specially, here is the clemency request. Make sure you see that. Make sure you think about that carefully before, I don't know how much he highlighted it, but I have no question that Holt would have brought all of the necessary papers forward. Certainly, I believe on the morning of July 7th, the day of the execution, the newspapers were reporting on the clemency request. So if the newspapers knew, it's unthinkable to me, and this is in advance of the execution, it is unthinkable to me that that clemency request was not also known by the President of the United States.
Was that clemency request, was that the papers were reporting on, was that from the commissioners leaking it? Or do you think it was because Adele Douglas, Stephen Douglas's wife, a widow, was trying to get in and did get in to see, and also, of course, Mary Surratt's daughter also was trying to get
Anna
in.
Surratt,
so
right.
everyone knew that they were trying to get clemency.
Right. I don't know what the source of it is, but I know that the information was out there. It could have been from a number of different sources, of course, a number of people in the War Department and so on. I also know that Johnson's first accusation against Holt with regard to the clemency plea doesn't come until 1867. That's the first time. He claims that Holt never showed it to him. And Holt responds by saying, and Holt, of course, remains Johnson's Judge Advocate General into March of 1869, and later defends himself when Johnson raises this accusation again, says, how could you possibly have kept me on as Judge Advocate General if I had so violated my trust as an officer in the War Department? So I have no question that he showed him all the papers that he was there to show. I wouldn't put it past Holt to not, as I said, pick the clemency. I think he felt Mary Surratt was guilty and she absolutely should be executed, but I do not think that he would have railroaded her and kept information from the president that he should have known.
Or just put it down.
Or just, right. I'm sure it was among the papers. I'm not sure that he would have pulled it out and said, make sure you see this.
Both Wallace and Holt, of course, who had their roles in the conspiracy trial. Here are sketches that Lew Wallace produced while he was a judge. What was he thinking?
He was bored.
Wallace was bored to tears. Wallace, they reread the entire transcript of the day before, early when the trial started. So he was bored, and he loved to draw. He loved to draw from the time he was a child. So he drew the conspirators because it was an occupation for him, and the trial bored him.
And the rereading of the transcripts of the previous day could take 2 to 3 hours. And the rereading was something that Holt stipulated should happen every day to make sure that the trial was being conducted fairly. He bored the poor Lew Wallace. Wallace was very easily bored.
I'm going to go back to the trial, but since I have this book open, here is in the Wallace study, this is a huge
It's
oil
a very
painting
large oil painting.
that's sitting in his study that he did post war.
That is absolutely, he did that in 1867. That is one of the primary reasons why I am absolutely positive Wallace believed they were guilty, because he didn't write a lot about the trial. But he did that. That is a drawing he calls The Conspirators at the second inaugural. Mary Surratt is not in it, but he told his wife, she's not in it because I never was able to capture her because of a heavy veil she wore during the trial. So, and he exhibited it to the people of Crawfordsville and said, these people are guilty.
And you said he did not sign the clemency request.
He did not sign the clemency request. He would believe Mary Surratt was guilty.
Well, one of the reasons I wanted to show that oil painting, which is amazing, everyone should, if you're near Crawfordsville, should go and see
it's
that.
a wonderful painting.
But I just read in the paper the other day that in Dana, Indiana, Ernie Pyle's home is in trouble, and the war correspondent in the Second World War, and the state of Indiana owns that and has taken out sometime before all the materials, typewriter and other things that were on display. They took it out and took it down to Indianapolis, and they're fearful that they're not going to have the money to keep open the Ernie Pyle home at this point. Who owns the Crawfordville home, and could that be in the same sort of trouble?
The city of Crawfordsville owns Wallace's study.
Uh-huh.
It could be, although it's one of the things that the city is most proud of having. They
So
call
was Dana.
themselves the city of Ben-Hur. And so they are quite supportive of the study, and the study has had some very excellent directors over the past 5 to 10 years who have raised a lot of money and created a group of donors who keep things going. They just got grants and got the dome, the wonderful dome on the study redone. And very exciting for me, they were trying to take the dome down to its original paint, and they found that the original dome was painted with military symbols.
Oh.
And they're now trying to raise $20,000 to restore the dome originally, and I can't wait.
Did he have any impact as a lawyer?
He wrote one legal brief on whether it was appropriate for a military commission to try civilians. It's the standard brief. The city is under martial law. The commander-in-chief, who is a member of the Army, has been assassinated. Therefore, this is totally appropriate. Other than that I know of, Wallace may have had impact with his fellow commissioners in terms of, well, this is a point of law, this is a point of law. But Wallace wrote virtually nothing about the trial. He wrote a few letters to his wife. I think he believed he was going to write about it in his autobiography, but he died after completing the portion on monocracy. His wife finished it, but all she did was collect his letters to her. So there's very little information about what Wallace actually did in that trial, other than we know he drew.
Yes, he did, and well, but nonetheless,
Yes.
it's an interesting thing. Holt and Stanton, were they in accord with the South's complicity, alleged complicity in the assassination?
Were they in accord in terms of believing that
Yes.
that people like Jefferson Davis had been involved?
Exactly.
Well, I think it's very clear that Holt felt that,
Mhm.
and I think that Stanton pretty much believed what Holt believed. It's not as clear to me what Stanton down the line may have thought, but when he handed over the investigation to Holt, he handed it over with the faith that Holt would come to understand the assassination accurately and present it accurately to the public. And certainly when the first wanted posters went out and the first explanation went to Andrew Johnson about who really was involved, and Jefferson Davis's name was on those posters and in that document asserting the South's complicity, Stanton would have approved that statement. So I think he probably did. I will say that is a place where I feel that Holt blundered badly. I can explain it in my own way, but I don't think he's wrong to have made the initial assumption that Jefferson Davis might have been involved. I don't even think if John Wilkes Booth or John Surratt had gone to Jefferson Davis and said, "Shall I kill President Lincoln?" I personally think Jefferson Davis would have said, "Sure, go ahead." I don't know, but
Well, he may have felt, Jefferson Davis, that Lincoln was trying to kill him, and
that's
he
right,
kept
exactly,
Dahlgren
right,
with, so
exactly.
it's always that.
Right, but I think that that where Holt blundered was in his desperation to prove that was so, and hard as he tried, in some cases involving people whose testimony was really quite questionable.
Well, they're
Not
saying
in
for
terms of the
Conover.
immediate conspirators, but in terms of this larger grand
yes.
conspiracy. That's where he blundered, because he just could not believe that this bunch of bumpkins could have done it themselves.
Well, how did he perform overall? Were you okay with how he performed overall, even though he brought in Sanford Conover, whom you just really were speaking about?
Yes, I think
That
that
was
he
a blunder you mentioned.
Yes, absolutely. I think that he performed extremely well overall. I think he tried to run a very fair trial. I think, especially given the depth of his rage over this assassination of the man whose initial safety in Washington he personally had overseen, and all of the work he had done during the war, including trying to uncover subterranean organizations in the North that were trying to undermine Lincoln and the Union effort and so on. I certainly think his attempts were understandable, and I think that the people who duped him were very clever, and they knew exactly how to hook Holt into this scheme that they had to just basically make money and cause trouble. And I think it's sad that he was duped in this way, but it certainly is in some ways understandable. And in the overall picture of his performance, not just in that trial, but the overall picture of his performance on the nation's behalf throughout his professional career, I think it's a blip. A significant blip, but a blip.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's an interesting point here about the Wirtz Commission. Wallace was made president of the commission, the military commission that tried the Captain Wirtz, the commandant of Andersonville, and before the trial, Wallace wrote his wife that our friends in the Advocate General's office, as he called it, are intent on proving that the directions came from Jefferson Davis. And then Wallace wrote, "We shall see." So clearly at that point, Wallace had the sense, the knowledge that they were trying to implicate Jefferson Davis.
Oh, right. Wirtz
this
for
sort
Holt
of
was definitely
classic.
part of this whole complex of Davis's terrible dastardly deeds.
Jacob Thompson, the Confederate agent out of Canada especially, Holt and he had a relationship that went back, no?
Yes.
Yes. Briefly explain that.
Well, he had known him when they were both in Buchanan's government, and they had clashed over the issue of Union, and Thompson went with the Confederacy and Holt went with the Union, and there was tremendous bitterness that lasted many, at least 2 decades, I'd say, and after the war, and it was really around there were various ways in which it presented itself, but it was really around this issue of who stood by his oath to the Union and who did not. And it's a very passionate confrontation that keeps having these eruptions over the course of much of Holt's post-war life.
George from Utah has emailed in a question, on a question I was going to ask anyway. Wallace was best known for his battle with Jubal Early at Monocacy during his time in Maryland. Would you say a few words about what else he accomplished during the period he was assigned to Baltimore?
That's something, again, that's unknown because it's not military. Wallace was actually, when Lincoln first made Wallace the commander of the Middle Department of Delaware and Maryland, he called Wallace in and he said, "Our friends in Maryland are about to free their slaves via a constitutional process. I want you to oversee that, and I want it made clear that the military is not involved," because the military had been very much involved in previous Maryland elections to the extent of intervening at the polls to remove various voters they thought were probably not loyal. Wallace immediately went to work with the governor of Maryland. Now, no military commander in Baltimore had ever been to Annapolis. Wallace dressed himself up in full dress uniform, took his entire staff to Baltimore, and met with the governor and said, essentially, we want to do this right. We want to do this so there is no sense of military interference. The governor promised that he would institute a strict loyalty oath. Wallace said, I will make sure that the troops will only go to the polls if the judges of election call them, and if they are called by judges of election, I will order them to stay a full mile away from the polls and not intervene unless requested. So here was this first fair election. Maryland officials were stunned, but loved it. And Marylanders voted to emancipate their slaves. And a constitutional amendment was passed, added to the Maryland Constitution. It was really a marvelous thing, and Lincoln called him in and said thank you, and it sent Wallace a note, which Wallace treasured. And then, of course, Wallace had to keep lid on secession in Maryland. And there were what I'll call more showy secessionists in Maryland, people who would send, one woman actually bought a sword for Wade Hampton, had it inscribed, and put it in the mail. Of course it was intercepted, and Wallace called the lady in and said, if you do this one more time, something like this, you will accompany this sword into the South. I'll send you south. Wallace was tough, but he was fair. So I think he did an excellent job, and to this day, Maryland historians will tell you that Wallace was the best military commander of Maryland.
I'm going to have you sign a few of the books that we have already sold. If you'd like to have one out there inscribed, this is your moment to probably send in an order. I want to thank Harold in Pottsville, Pennsylvania, Robert in Richmond, Virginia, Gary in Shreveport, Louisiana, James in Naperville, Illinois, Roy in Lebanon, Tennessee, James in Brown Deer, Wisconsin, as always, thank you, Stephen in Decatur, Illinois, Frank in Turner, Oregon, Stan in Mount Pulaski, Illinois, Kim in Schaumburg, Illinois, Todd in Des Moines, Iowa, Jerry in Rochester, New York, Chad in Atlanta, Georgia, and Kevin in Betancourt, Iowa,